Before we move on, let me just acknowledge some of the other guests on the stage. They won't be speaking, but we're very pleased to have with us, of course, one of our patrons who's been here for 2 days, Professor Dr. Atul Rahman. Thank you for being here. We have also with us Andrew Turner, who's the Political and Commercial Counselor at the Canadian High Commission. Welcome to you, Andrew. And also, of course, Samir Dossal, who is the President of the Canada-Pakistan Business Council in Canada. Good to have you all here. Let's move on with the next presentation. We're also very happy to have from overseas Professor Dr. Wendy Cukier, who's the President of IT Management at the Ted Rogers School of Management at Ryerson University. She's also founder of the Diversity Institute of Canada, and she's here to talk to us about disruptive innovation. Wendy.
Thanks very much. It's really a thrill to be here, and I got off the plane at about 4 o'clock this morning, so apologies if I'm less than coherent. I wanted to talk a little bit about disruptive technologies in a general sense and their implications for building an innovation ecosystem. And I know there are many people in the room who have done a lot of work in Pakistan to build capacity, and perhaps this will be of some interest. The speakers before me today, as well as speakers yesterday, have talked about many of these technologies in detail, so I'm really just going to point to them at a... I'm going to just provide a quick overview because I know that we have some time constraints, and I'll look forward to your questions. So this is what I wanted to talk about: disruptive technologies at a high level. Talk a little bit about innovation, because there's a lot of discussion about innovation, but that is often a far cry from actually doing innovation. How ecosystems work. And I wanted to talk just a bit about universities for the 21st century. Prior to taking my sabbatical, I was the Vice President of Research and Innovation at Ryerson University, so I've spent a fair amount of time thinking about the role of universities and how they can play a role. So there's been a lot of work done on trying to understand disruptive and exponential technologies, and there's Christensen's book is sort of the classic, which argued that there's a real dilemma because incumbent companies take a big risk if they innovate because of the potential that they will cannibalize their existing business. And this is what's referred to as the innovator's dilemma. Very often, as a result, innovation actually occurs on the periphery. It's not the mainstream companies that break the mold. There are some exceptions. And we have lots and lots of organizations and individuals who are self-styled futurists, organizations that will give you the list of the top 10 disruptive technologies, or the top 12, or the top 5. You can pick the ones that interest you the most. But what's important, I think, is to keep abreast of some of these changes. And I spent a week at Singularity University, which was kind of life-changing. And there's some really interesting work that comes out of there that at least, I don't think their predictions are correct. In fact, I would say that half of the predictions are wrong. You just don't know which half. But keeping tabs on what's being predicted is important. We've heard a bit already about artificial intelligence and machine learning, and there's a huge push in Canada to develop more computer scientists, more coders, and so on. Now people are saying we don't even know what that's going to look like because machines may be able to program themselves. And even in the last couple of years, we've seen tremendous impact of artificial intelligence on, in areas we didn't necessarily expect it. So there was recently a study done looking at the impact of financial advisors that were essentially bots on the internet compared to humans. And the financial advisors that were a combination of infobots and artificial intelligence actually outperformed humans in providing advice to customers. For a long time in Western countries in particular, we've talked about having an information economy and thinking that people with PhDs were going to be protected by the disruption that technology is bringing. And in fact, what we're finding with artificial intelligence, professions like anesthesiology, very skilled medical specialists run the risk of being replaced by machines which can do a better job. And when you think about the nature of medicine, it is often very hit or miss. And if you have machines that actually have access to the databanks of all the symptoms, in many cases they can come up with better diagnostics. Associated Press is using artificial intelligence to write business articles now. So there are areas that are being disrupted by this technology that I don't think any of us predicted. A number of people have talked about the Internet of Things, which is really a combination of sensors, big data, and networks, and extends from everything from connected vehicles to wearables. Gartner estimates there's 6.4 billion connected devices now. I think that's more connected devices than humans, if I'm not mistaken. And the impact of that technology extends far beyond energy and utilities to farming. They now have smart sensors that you can scatter in your fields that will tell you when you need to water your crops, wearable technologies that can predict whether or not we're going to have a heart attack or not. So the impact of the Internet of Things is massive in almost every sector and does have the potential to actually disrupt employment for everything from truck drivers to repair people. Big data analytics has also been mentioned. What I find really interesting about big data is many organizations are investing heavily in it and have, I was working with one company that had hired 90 data scientists in order to better inform decision making. The problem was the managers would have none of it. So they had almost parallel systems. They had heavily information-intensive, intelligent decision-making, but the decisions that were actually being made in the organization by the people who had the power to run the company were not necessarily taking advantage of it. And I mention that because that's a theme that's going to come up over and over. The notion that having technology and having innovation are not necessarily the same thing. Additive manufacturing, 3D printing, has gone from being a novelty to starting to be mainstream. I don't know if there are people here from aerospace, but certainly in aerospace, it's become a very important part of the supply chain process. We've heard about 3D printing on space stations and so on. Have any of you seen the work that's being done on 3D printed prosthetics, artificial limbs, arms and legs at a distance in places that don't have easy access to those devices? So you can produce a working artificial arm for about $10 or $15 using additive manufacturing at a distance. I was at a competition Wednesday night where one of the winners is 3D printing homes for remote locations for about $10,000, and they've shown that you can 3D print an entire vehicle. It's not cost effective yet in mass production kinds of environments, but for sure it has the potential to be disruptive. Nanotechnology, there are lots of scientists in the room, so I won't presume to talk much about this, other than to say the idea that you can swallow pills that will have little tiny robots and cameras in them to actually do diagnosis and repair kind of blows my mind, but it's just one of the integrated kinds of technologies. We're seeing new materials for everything from preventing infections in hospitals, for example, by coating things with thin layers that will prevent infections, to implantables and all manner of things that I think for many of us were the subject of science fiction. You've heard lots about alternative energy. I won't talk much about this at all, other than I was at a session with Elon Musk, who was talking about the curve for alternative energy and the cost effectiveness of electricity versus other sources of energy. And the thing that got everyone's attention was the fact that the Tesla's acceleration rate blows traditional vehicles away because it operates on entirely different principles. So it's not just the ecological appeal of that, it's also the performance. How many people in the room have used augmented reality or virtual reality, who have experienced that? Is that true, or are some of you just not putting your hands up? Again, it's the stuff that science fiction is made of. And while people originally thought the application of the technology was primarily going to be in the context of gaming, and that's certainly where it got a lot of its initial traction, now we're seeing applications in all kinds of training, including very sophisticated technical training, healthcare, and so on. And I just was, one of my former students has developed an application that makes you feel like you are touring Johannesburg. He did it with the South African government. So the impact of that technology on everything from tourism to education to healthcare, massive and potentially transformative. I know you've heard from some people and are going to hear from some more people about fintech and what's happening with the disruption of financial services and the potential of blockchain technologies to completely transform what we think of as banking by providing secure digital currency without middle people. And of course, genomics and gene editing and its applications have tremendous potential, not just for human health, but for agriculture as well. And then, of course, robotics. And there are actually people starting to write articles about the rights of robots and how we're going to deal with some of the ethical issues when it comes to robotics, because for every one of the technologies that I've pointed to, and there are many others, I'm not talking about cybersecurity or space travel. I was at a session where they were talking about how to effectively mine meteorites, and you know that Musk is planning to take people to Mars or something. That's too much for me to imagine. But what's interesting to me is for every one of these technologies, there are potential positive impacts, but there are also negative impacts. There are ethical implications, legal implications, regulatory implications, and social implications. We're seeing robots. Have any of you been served by a robot yet in a hotel or a restaurant? Yep, a few of you. I was at a hotel in Silicon Valley, and they had a robot concierge who would come to your room and bring you stuff if you needed it. So the impact of that in terms of employment, and we saw this with the first industrial revolution, is potentially massive. It has huge, all these technologies have massive potential for improving productivity and performance in businesses, creating new products and services and so on, but they also have the potential to eliminate many of the jobs that currently exist. In fact, there was a study out of Oxford that suggested that by 2020, about 50% of employment in the US potentially is at risk. And as I said earlier, it's not necessarily the jobs that we thought historically were put at risk with technology. So I think disruption is really important to think about, but we know from history it's also very hard to predict. And I worked with someone who's very rich and successful, I am not, who makes his living talking about technology and making predictions. And I'm as right as often as he is, because he says this is going to happen, and I say no, it's not. And half the time he's right, and half the time I'm right, but he's rich and I'm just a professor. And the reason why that's important is technology does not produce innovation. A lot of people are confused about what innovation is, right? Having a technology does not mean you have innovation. Innovation only occurs if the technology is used to drive change. And in Canada, for example, we have amazing water technology, we have smart grid, we have all kinds of things. But our utilities have an interest in maintaining the status quo, and there is very little incentive for them to do things differently. And so if you're thinking about innovation, you have to think about markets, you have to think about organizations, you have to think about policies and structures that are going to drive change rather than impede it. The other thing that I think is critically important is, you know, people mentioned before Uber and Airbnb and many of the services that now are provided without any kind of physical infrastructure. The fact is the technologies that underpin Uber in particular, those are boring technologies. Those are trivial technologies. But what's different about Uber and Airbnb and many of the other organizations that were mentioned, you know, think about Dell and others, is they've put technologies together in different ways. So it wasn't the technologies themselves that were disruptive, it was the combination of the technologies to do something different that was disruptive. And I think that's something that often gets overlooked. And so when we think about innovation, it is important to recognize that, of course, it can be new products and services, it can be new processes, or it can be new business models. And Uber and Airbnb would be examples of those. I've been around the ICT industry since before some of you were born. It hurts me to say that, but one of the first things I worked on was video conferencing in the early 1980s. I worked with the Institute for the Future. Now, video conferencing technology had actually been unveiled at the World Fair, and I think it was 1964. In 1980, we were still saying video conferencing is going to change the world, right? And today, it's maybe now getting the traction that we thought it potentially was going to have 30 years ago. Just if you look at this first quote, obstacles to the practical use of computerized medical records exist, but many expect these to vanish within a few years. That was written in 1990. In the city of Toronto, which arguably is a center of advanced technology, I can make a restaurant reservation easier than I can book an appointment with my doctor, and I most certainly don't have access to my health records. It's not about the technology, it's about the ways in which our doctors are compensated, the ways in which our healthcare is structured, the ways in which it's fragmented, and so on. So it's important to recognize those things. Canada leads in consumer applications of mobile technology, but business applications are lagging. 40% of our small, medium enterprises aren't even on the internet, okay? Again, adoption is a huge issue. And it's interesting to me because a lot of people try to predict the future looking at the past, and I love this quote from Henry Ford, who invented an automobile, I don't know if it was really the first one, who said if he'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And if you think about Apple and the iPhone, that wasn't driven by functionality. Steve Jobs is an artist. It was about aesthetics. It was about identity. Who would buy a device where you can't change the battery? Like, if you approach it from a functional, rational perspective, this thing would never have taken off. It had to do with a lot of other things. And so understanding the role of emotion and irrationality in driving change is important. I also wanted to flag, because I think it's important around the world, we're not just talking about the private sector, we have to think about innovation processes in the context of government, in the context of social goals. We have to think about frugal innovation at the bottom of the pyramid, because there are all sorts of amazing things. The solar cooker is one of the most transformative technologies around. It's cheap, it's easy, and it can change people's lives. And when we think about building innovation ecosystems, universities have to play an important role, but so do investors, startups, and existing companies, because if you're not also looking at driving change within established organizations, you have no markets for the new products and services that the startups are creating. And so I'll just wrap up, because I'm getting the secret sign. What's absolutely core when we think about developing innovation ecosystems, and I was really pleased to have a chat with Professor Ato Rahman today, because it's clear this is very much on Pakistan's agenda, is thinking about talent, thinking about the skills gap, thinking about who's going to drive the innovation in the companies. People are our biggest resource, and in Canada, we also recognize that leveraging diversity is critical. And I'll leave you on this note, because I think in the current environment, it's one of the things I will say for the Canadians on the panel that the country really recognizes, is that brains are way more important than anything else, and we have an unprecedented opportunity to take advantage of that. For those of you who can't read this, it says, "We don't care what's on your head, we care what's in it." Thank you.
Wendy, thank you so much. Sorry to hurry you up. We need to make time for people to do their Friday duties. But thank you for your presentation, given the fact that you only got here at 3 a.m. this morning, which is brilliant. We do have just a couple of minutes. If there is a question from the floor, I'd like to take it. We'd like to get some of the audience involved. So please raise your hand if you want to ask a question of any of our audience here.
Can I make a couple of points?
Certainly. Professor, go ahead.
To add to these excellent presentations, one or two things. One is that on the horizon, we now have quantum computing coming in. And Google has come forward with the first very fast quantum computer, which is 100 million times faster than normal computers. And that's going to be able to manipulate big data much more effectively than standard computers, because it works not on the binary 0-1 system, but on qubits. And D-Wave in Canada is one system that's operational. So quantum computing and its interaction with bioinformatics, genomics, big data, etc. The second point, because there was an energy also mentioned, is the fantastic advances in solar cells. Solar cells normally just convert light into electricity, but now these are new types of solar cells, photon-enhanced thermionic emission cells, PET cells. And these convert heat also into electricity. So they have efficiencies of more than 50%. So that's, and lastly, one of the most exciting experiments that's going on right now is in the south of France. And there was somebody who said we should learn from nature. Well, how does nature create its huge energy? Through fusion. So this is deuterium-tritium fusion reactions, and we have just about made it. We are on the borderline. If this works, then hydrogen fusion will be the key source of energy for the future.
And it was Jeff who said we need to learn from nature, but if we have that kind of energy production, then your business model is going to look a little bit worried.
Absolutely. It's going to change.